Okay, so we are continuing on. We started just briefly last week on Mem Zayin Amud Aleph. Let's see, it's about maybe 10, 15, 12 lines from the wide lines on the bottom. It starts Bameh Konin. So we sort of finished the discussions about whether or not kesef monies, different kesef can be used for chalipin, either for the exchange or as an item itself of the exchange, although it may come up once or twice. But by and large, we reached, the only resolution we reached is that you cannot, although there are some who say you can, but by and large, we say that you cannot. So now the Gemara turns its attention to the question of kinyan sudar. We all know what kinyan sudar is, and the most dramatic example, of course, is mechiras chametz that we're all familiar with, where we use a sudar for the mechira. Now, kinyan sudar can be one of two things. Let's just clarify. You can use a sudar for the exchange as we do in chametz. So there's no monetary transaction. There's a transaction of a sudar, and then through the use of the sudar, the handkerchief or the cloth or whatever it is, what we do is we make a transference. There's also a case of kinyan sudar where the kinyan sudar is the preliminary to an actual exchange of goods for money. So there's two types of kinyan sudar. We primarily are familiar with the former because there's no money or anything that changes hands. The sudar is used as the kinyan in order to transfer the chametz to, as it is the rav, the rabbi, who then deals with the non-Jew. But there is a more active type of kinyan sudar and we'll see the Gemara will talk about that. Is the kinyan sudar is just the first step to an actual monetary transaction, money for goods. Okay, so keep that in mind. So the Gemara asked the Joker, Bameh Konin, with what are we konin? And by the way, we've made reference to this Gemara repeatedly in the last few daf when we said, wait till we get to Mem Zayin and Aleph, and we're going to understand what we mean by an exchange. So the Gemara constantly reference what we're now going to learn is how this happens. We know it happens, and we know the source of it is Megillas Rus, and we know the source of it is the Shiur. But now the Gemara is going to actually go into discussing that. Bameh Konin, Rav Omar. Rav says, Bekelov shel kone, delichale lekone lave makne kone, kihecha deligmor, v'niknale. So, okay, so according to Rav, and this is now the actual machlekes. According to Rav, that who owns the sudar? Now, in the case of the chametz, we know it's usually the Rav who takes the sudar out of his pocket, and you lift it up, and then he makes the kinyan with you, and then you make the transference. But let's talk about a practical case, not just a case like that, where there's actually going to be a money for goods. Whose sudar do we use? Doesn't matter. So Rav says you use the sudar of the koine. What does it mean, the koine? It's the one who will be receiving the item. Meaning, if I make a transaction with Menashe and I'm going to give or sell to Menashe an item, let's say a truck, and he's going to give me money for that truck, and we do it with a kinyan sudar, so the person who is going to be buying the truck, who is that? Menashe. He is the one who produces the sudar. Why? Because it's in his interest that I should make that kinyan as quickly as possible, because we know once I make the kinyan, he gets the truck. So why wait? Okay, so he's going to produce the sudar. I take the sudar. The minute I lift the sudar, there's a kinyan. And once there's a kinyan, the deal is done. Remember, we don't, in a sudar, it's a chalipin, we don't have to make a reciprocal action. It's a one-way action. So Rav makes perfect sense, okay? It's the one who has the greatest incentive, the one buying the truck. Okay, understood. Now, there's a machlekes though. Levi Omar, Levi argues on Rav, and he says, "Bekelev shel makne." No, it's my kli, my handkerchief that's used, and my handkerchief is the one that is going to be make the transaction. And we're going to explain why it's mine. But remember, so it's an easy understand on Rav's part, because the incentive is with the buyer, with the one who wants to buy the item. However, Levi says that's not the way it works. And again, we're going to discuss it further and see from the pasuk, try to understand from the pasuk in Rus what the pasuk is saying. Okay. So having said that, machlekes, Rav Huna Midiskra says to Rava, Levi the Omar. According to Levi, who says Bekelev shel makne, with my kli, I'm the seller, then listen to what's going to happen. Ara agav galima. It's going to wind up being the purchase of land, which we defined as nechosim sheyesh behem achrayis. Agav galima, on the back of, remember we learned about a kinyan agav. What's a kinyan agav? You make a kinyan on one item and the second item just whisks along. But that's typically, as the Gemara will say, is you make a kinyan on nechosim sheyesh l'machrayis, meaning karka, and the metaltalin gets swept along because it is the lesser of the two. So we make a kinyan on the greater of the two, and the lesser of the two gets swept along.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Go ahead.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Was there another view that says, what kind of a question is this? What's the difference? Whoever's pulls out a handkerchief, the kinyan should happen, because that's the whole purpose of their standing next to each other, is to complete the transaction that they're after. So is there another view that says it shouldn't matter?
No. Okay. So the answer is no, there's not another view that says it doesn't matter, because remember, we're learning it out from an actual pasuk. So we're going to try to understand what happened when Boaz stepped in, because the Goel, do you remember there was a Goel who was supposed to redeem the property of Elimelech and Machlon and Kilyon. He said, I don't want to do it. Boaz said, I will do it. He was next in line. So we're going to try to understand what happened. Whose shoe was it? Was it Boaz's shoe, or was it the shoe of the unidentified Goel who did not redeem? So you're going to say, why does it matter? And the answer will be, it matters because if a kinyan has to be had, and let's just say for argument's sake that the kinyan has to be with the one with the makneh, like Levi says, then we're adamant that it has to be his. If the Kona produces it, it isn't a valid kinyan, because the makneh was the one who was supposed to have the goods. So it's not just, it doesn't matter, the first one to whip out the item is good. This is an actual machlokes between Rav and Levi, that it's significant whose item it is, because if it's not that person's item, the kinyan doesn't go through. So there isn't a view that says it doesn't matter, but Rav and Levi say it matters to me which item because theoretically you could argue that if Levi says it has to be the makneh, then if the Kona does it, you haven't made a kinyan, and vice versa. That's at least what we learned from the face of it, is because let's say it was the unidentified suitor, the unidentified relative, and he didn't do it and Boaz did it, then arguably there's no kinyan, because Boaz didn't do it the right way. Because what does the pasuk mean? We don't know what the pasuk means yet. We're going to get to it, but we're going to have to understand what the pasuk means, because the language of the language of the pasuk, when we actually going to read it in a minute, you might be able to argue both ways, or you might be able to say no, it's clear. That we'll have a brief discussion, but at least there is an interpretation here. as there always is between two, in this case, Amoraim, we're going to argue that Tanorim also argue the same thing. But anyway, so the answer, long and short, Jay, is it does matter, and we're going to see in a minute how it matters. But according to Levi, that says that it's the makneh, then what's going to happen is that you're going to acquire the chosam sheyesh b'machrais, meaning karka agav glima. We've learned always the opposite. So according to Levi, the kasha is on Levi. According to Rav, who says it's the Kona who buys it. So if the Kona is the one who's making the transaction, then he's transacting with a sudar, and he is going to be Kona the item, the item, whatever it is. It could be the chosam she'ein lo hamachrais. It's a metaltalin. But according to Levi, who says that no, that the Kinyan Sudar is the one who's actually making the transfer, meaning he's going to get the money, then we have a problem, because then he's acquiring the chosim sheyesh lo machrayas on the back of the chosim she'ein lo machrayas, and that can't be, because that's beferish, that it has to be the heavier of the two, the chosim sheyesh lo machrayas, the karka. Then that's a problem. That's a problem here. So that's the kasha on Levi. That's the kasha on Levi. So on Malay, so the Gemara gives an interesting answer. Ihava Levi hacha. If Levi was here in the Beis Medrash and heard the kasha, have a mapik la'apech pulsa denura. So Rashi says, abik malsa denura. Nitzutzis shel or, beams of light. Sheina gulos kepulsa de omer lekama asimam pulsa loshen samto k'omale shechad shebazeh. He would shoot beams of light out of his eyes in anger that you have asked this kasha on him. It's a colorful way of the Gemara saying, "Are you kidding? This is a kasha on Levi. Levi doesn't even gyrus this. How could you argue that according to Levi, it's the chosam she'ein lo machrayas on the back, the chosam sheyesh lo machrayas on the back of the chosam she'ein lo machrayas? So what does it mean? Mi savar glima maknalei beyanod mekamel kabel minei. So the Gemara introduces an interesting chiddush, that the Kinyan Sudar is not the item that makes the transaction. The Kinyan Sudar is merely a preliminary. It's a goodwill gesture to actually make the transaction. So in other words, in the case of an actual transaction, not the Chometz B'Pesach scenario, but the case of a transaction where one is going to exchange the truck for money, and we use a Kinyan Sudar, the Kinyan Sudar doesn't make the Kinyan. The Kinyan Sudar, says the Gemara, is the Hanod Kamul Kabel. He wants to infuse in him the fact that there's goodwill that's happening here, so he should make the transaction. So it's nothing but a preliminary, but not an actual Kinyan. So according to Levi, you can't argue that Levi is saying it's going to be a case of the chosim sheyesh lo machrayas on the back of the chosim she'ein lo machrayas, which would be totally wrong. That's not what's going on here. This is a regular transaction. The handkerchief is merely a goodwill gesture between the parties that we're going to make a transaction. But the handkerchief does not conclude the transaction. So that's Levi's answer on the kasha of, according to Levi, this can't be because it's the chosim sheyesh lo machrayas, which are being kind of with the chosim she'ein lo machrayas, which is a no-no. Okay, so that's his answer. That's Levi's answer. That it's nothing but a goodwill gesture. Okay, so let's take a look at Rashi, because this is an interesting exchange between Rav and Levi. So Rashi says, Rashi says, but Kinyan Chalipin, the cause of Bekra, Shalavish Nalo, right? The pasuk in Rus, Shalavish Nalo, Mi Shalaf Venosan. Who took off the shoe and gave it? That's the kasha we asked. From the language of the pasuk, we're going to see the ambiguity that it's not clear that it was Boaz or the unnamed heir. They'll have a makne kona es a kli. Kokona ara avgavglina. So according to Levi, you would be purchasing land on the back of a metaltalin, hanosim karka lechavero bikinyan sudar. If someone wants to exchange karka, meaning an intangible, like land, bikinyan sudar v'hamakabel masna mushachasudar miyad hanosein. So, and we're saying that the makne is the one who is going to give the sudar v'niktelo hakarka and the sudar. So he's going to acquire the karka, the nechosim sheyesh lahem achrayis imasudar with the sudar, which is the chosim she'ein lahem achrayis, but meshicha sasudar, with just the meshicha sheniktim meshicha, and that can't be. You can't have the more stringent item, the karka, be acquired by the less stringent item. That was the kasha on Levi. In ken havale karka nikten metaltalin b'meshicha b'davar she kinyan lemetaltalin ve'eni kinyan lekarka. It's good. It's meshicha is a kinyan for a movable, not for an immovable. How do you kona karka with meshicha? You're not moving the land. You're not schlepping the land. That has to be done with either you can say it's with a chazaka but not meshicha. So it seems the Mashiach of the Sudar is acquiring the karka, and that can't be. So he answers him, no. Mapik la'apach pulsa denura, like we said. So Levi says, what are you kidding? Nitzusa shel or, the beams of light. Oglos kapulsa dormin lekamen a simon pulsa l'oshen samta komale shechashdo bezu. So he's saying, it's impossible that can be the case. Me Savris. Okay.
All right. So welcome, Tzvi just joined us. And for Tzvi and anybody else, if you lost the place, we're just above the wide lines on Memzal and Zayin Amud Aleph.
Right. We're just above the wide line. Okay. So now we've clarified that we've clarified the machlokes tanoim between Rav and Levi. Rav says that it's the person acquiring who's the one whose sudar we use. And Levi says it's the person who is transferring the property, and there's no kasha about agav because the handkerchief is a goodwill gesture. It is not part of the kinyan. According to Rav, it's part of the kinyan. According to Levi, it's not part of the kinyan. It's a goodwill preliminary. Says the Gemara.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Do we have other cases where there's a goodwill activity taking place before something else happens?
No. This is introducing that concept for the first time, that as a preliminary to a kinyan, we're doing goodwill. And it's only according to Levi, who finds himself under assault by the kasha of, how can you do that? It's the chosim sheyesh l'machrayis, which are being nicknamed with chosim she'ein l'machrayis. So Levi right away says, no. Remember how the Gemara works. I mean, the kasha is a legitimate kasha, and Levi says you have the wrong havamina because the galima, the handkerchief, was never part of the kinyan. Now, we've not heard that before, but that's Levi Shita. And now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute, that's not even Levi, just Levi. There's a machlok, and who's a mora. There's a machlokes tanoim. Let's go to the machlokes tanoim. Kitanoi. It's a machlokes tanoim. What's the machlokes tanoim? So he quotes the pasuk. I'm going to read from the pasuk. The pasuk in Rus Perek Daled pasuk Zayin. So the Megillah here gives us sort of black letter law. What's the black letter law? V'zos lefanim b'Yisrael. This is from reading from Rus. This was the custom in Eretz Yisrael. Al ha'geula v'al ha'tamura. And again, we're going to define that in a minute. But a geula means essentially it means redemption. V'al ha'tamura, and on the exchange. We're going to see what that means in a minute. Lekayim kol davar, in order to be makayim, to fulfill every matter, meaning every transaction. Sholaf ish nalo, a man, doesn't say who, a sholaf ish nalo, a man takes off his shoe, v'nosan l're'eyu, and he gives it to the other person. V'zos ha'tu'uda b'Yisrael, and this is the tu'uda. Tu'uda is the proof, the actual proof b'Yisrael that an event took place. So this is a very powerful pasuk in Rus, which is the basis of all halacha and how Jews transact. This is the source of how Jews do business from Rus, Sholof Ishnalo. And remember now, all the machlekes that the Gemara gave. What is a nalo? A nalo is a utensil. Remember, we said that it's a utensil, not money. It's a utensil, not produce, not anything else. Just a utensil. Anything that is like a nalo can be used. Anything that is not like a yellow can't be used. So this is the pasuk. Now, what's the machlekes tanoim on this pasuk? Okay. So it says the Gemara. Okay. Second line, Geula zu mechira. That when it says Geula, that you're going to redeem, it means mechira. How do we know mechira? Because look at Rashi, Geula zu mechira, near the last of the three before the wide lines, and Rashi at the bottom. Shamachalo mechira gemura bedamim, that he sold him a mechira gemura with money, v'lo kibul mos, and he didn't accept money. Uborn l'kayim diver michirasan alidei kinyan. He didn't accept the money, but he wants to be mekayim the transaction through a kinyan. Now, there is okay. So, what does that mean? In actuality, it means that when it says geula, it means a mechira, not chalipin, but a mechira, a sale of money. But instead of using money, we use an item. Okay, that's what geula means. And there actually happens to be a Gemara elsewhere. I think it's the Gemara in Bechiros defines geula as mechira, because there the Gemara talks about if you take a behema and you consecrate it to make it, to bring it to Yerushalayim as a carbon, then you can't sell it. You're not allowed to sell it after that. So the Gemara there says geula means mechira because you can't sell it. So the definition of geula in this pasuk means mechira, sale. V'cheinu oma lo yigal, because there the Gemara says lo yigal. Tumura, what does the word tumura mean in Rus? Zu chalipin. That means the actual kinyan chalipin. So let's go back to the pasuk. V'zos lefnim b'Yisrael. This is the way Jews transact, al hageula, on a sale, al tumura, and on chalipin. Okay, you can transact two ways. You can sell an item, and you can exchange an item. Okay, so that's now black letter law that in Jewish halacha, two people can transact through mechira, money, or through chalipin, exchange of item. Good.
Rabbi, the use of the word lifnim suggests that it wasn't the law anymore.
Say it again.
The use of the word lifnim suggests that it wasn't the law anymore, that it was in those days, that's the way they did it. But suggests that's not current law. It was black letter law at the time of Rus.
At the time of Rus. I'm talking about the time of Rus.
But was no longer halacha at the time Shmuel wrote the book.
Okay. So you're right, David. You're getting ahead a little bit because we're going to understand what that law means today. You're right. At the time of Rus, they established the law. That was the way we transacted. We're going to see how that translates to today, right? Because everything evolves. But we're talking in real time in the time of the Gemara. The Gemara says that's the halacha. The halacha is that, okay, now let's break it down even further. So ala gula, that's a sale. Ala tamura, on an exchange. Okay. V'chein hu omer lo yachli penu. Okay, that and it says lo yachlipenu, that you can't be that you can't do chalipin. Below yomer also lekaim kol dover sholof ish nalo, benos l'reyo. All right. So now, so let's go back to so the kayim to fulfill kol dover, every kind of transaction. Again, very generic. So to be mekayim kol dover, to fulfill every kind of transaction, right? Sholof, that you have to take off the shoe and you have to exchange it. So that pasuk now is gonna put it under a microscope, and now we're gonna break down so we understand whose shoe it is and how it's done. Because right now from that pasuk we can't tell. All right, so. Okay, and the pasuk goes on to say the interpretation is lo yachli penu v'lo yamir oso, that you can't exchange it. Okay, v'lo yamir oso, you can't substitute. Okay, the kaim kol dover sholaf ishnala v'nos l'reyehu. So now, Frank the Gemara, mi no san lemi. Now we're going to get to the heart of it. Is mi no san lemi? Who gave? This is the $64,000 question. Who gave it to who? Boaz nosan legoel. So according to the Tanakama, Boaz took off his shoe and nosan legoel. So Boaz took off now Boaz is who? Boaz is the recipient. He's the koine, not the makne. This is like Rav. Boaz nosan legoel. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda, however, remember we're saying this is a machlokes tanoim. The machlokes between Rav and Levi is a machlokes tanoim. One Tana, the Tanakama, says that Boaz nosan legoel, which would be the equivalent of what Rav says. Rabbi Yehuda Omer goel nosan leboaz. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the Goel, the Makne, gave it to Boaz. In other words, so now we see that this machlokes is, according to the Tanoim, it's depending on which Tana, it's Boaz who took off his shoe, or the Goel, the unnamed Goel, who's the Makne, who holds, so Rabbi Yehuda holds like Levi, that it was the Makne who gave it. Now, okay, so we've clarified the machlokes. Now you're going to ask, what's the significance? All right, we'll get into the heart of the matter. But you see that it's significant enough that there's a machlokes tanoim as to whose shoe it was, because if you hold like Levi, if Boaz had taken it off, or like Rabbi Yehuda, if Boaz had taken it off, there would not have been a valid kinyan. Just like we say money is not a kinyan, the wrong person giving the shoe is not a kinyan. Okay, and again, you're right, David. This is the halacha that we're establishing at the time of the Gemara. This is what is significant. Okay, Tana Konin Bekli Afab. Now, so that's the machlokes. Says the Gemara further, Tana Konin Bekli, that this kli, this shoe that we're using as the example, you can be Konin Bekli Afab Pisha Aimbo Shava Pruta. Not only do we use a kli, but the kli is valid even if it's not worth a shava pruta. So look, we for instance by kedushin, right? We are meticulous to say that we have Eidim who say that the ring that the chassan is giving to the kala is of substance, because you have to have substance when you make a transaction. According to this Gemara, you don't have to have substance, because if the kli is not worth a shava pruta, which is the minimum that we establish for valuation purposes, it's okay as long as it's a kli. That's one way of looking at it. Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman says, Lo shani, we didn't learn that you can have an item that isn't worth a shava pruta, ela bekli, ela beperi, lo. But if you wanted to give produce, and by produce he means anything that isn't a kli. If you want to transact with peri, you may not transact with peri, even if the peri is worth a shava pruta, as Rashi says. Rashi says that Avo beperi kol davar she'ein kli lo va'afilu shava harbe. You can give something that's very valuable but isn't considered a kli, and you can't make a kinyan a sudar. Okay, again, so this is the discussion of the Gemara at the time. So they want to break it down to understand how a kinyan sudar works, what you can use, what it's worth. Okay. That's Rab Nachman. Rab Sheshes Amar. Rab Sheshes says, "Afilu beperis." You can actually use the a non-kli to make a kinyan sudar. He says, why? My tama Rab Nachman. Why does Rab Nachman say you can only use a kli? Or makron nalo. The pasuk that we learned it from says a shoe nol in midiachrin alo. Only a noel. Remember, this discussion that the Gemara is giving is what the Gemara in previous blot, the last 2, 3, 4 blot, has been referring to as the source for what it is that will allow for kinyan chalipin. So now, in this source, there's a machlekes between Rab Nachman and Rab Sheshes. According to Rab Nachman, the pasuk says nalo. It's noal in midiachrin alo. Anything that isn't equivalent to a noal, you can't use. Okay. Frek the Gemara, my Talmud Rab Sheshes. So then that's a good kasha. Why doesn't Rab Sheshes concede to Rab Nachman? Says the Gemara, Omakro lekayim kol dovar. To fulfill. Now look at the words. This is very important. Lekayim kol dovar. He's saying to fulfill any matter. He's interpreting kol dovar to mean with any matter. The word kol davar, precisely translated, means you can transact any transaction, kol davar, any matter. Rab Sheshes is interpreting it not as any matter, but with any matter, right? So he's using a broader definition of davar to say with any matter. If it's with any matter, then it's not just a noal, it's a utensil. It's even something that is not a utensil, like a produce. I mean, produce could be fruit, but it could be anything else. Not a kli, a ring. I mean, for instance, a ring which could have thousands of dollars of value, but it's not a kli.
Rabbi, wouldn't they use the word im kol davor if it was with?
Yeah, Michael, you're absolutely right. You would think that they would define it that way, but the Gemara is telling us that according to Reb Sheshes, kol davar doesn't mean that. You're 100% right. That's exactly what you would think, that it should say kol hadavar. In other words, it should be a little bit more broad to include an item, not kol davar, any matter. But that's Reb Sheshes' interpretation, that the word davar includes a non-kli. But your question is valid. So, but that's not what Reb Sheshes holds. He says the kaim kol davar. Frek the Gemara Rab Nachman namiksiv lekaim kol davar. So now this is the sort of the back and forth. If Reb Sheshes is correct that it says kol davar, what does Rab Nachman do with the word kol davar? Right? He says you could do it lekayim, that you can fulfill only with what it says in the pasuk, but it says kol davar, and Reb Sheshes is interpreting kol davar as anything, not just a noal, even a non-noal. So the good kasha. So what does Rab Nachman do with the words kol davar? Says the Gemara, hahu lekayim kol davar the niknan b'minol. So now he's using your definition and is saying that you can fulfill this with doing any kind of kinyan that you can use a shoe for. So he's being more precise on the wording that you just asked, right? You just asked that question. And Rab Nachman says, yes, that's the way I look at it, that the word l'kaim kol davar means what it says, kol davar. It doesn't mean with anything. It means a noal can acquire anything. So this is the machlokes. It's words. What does the word kol davar mean? Do you interpret it very narrowly, like Rab Nachman, or do you interpret it more loosely, like Rab Sheshes, that kol davar means using anything rather than with anything? Okay, that's the basis of the machlokes. Okay, fine. Frank the Gemara, Rav Sheshes Nami Ksiv Nolo. Okay, but so what does Rav Sheshes do with the word nolo? Because if he's going to say kol davar means with anything, but it says nolo. Why does it give an example of a nolo if you can use it with anything that isn't a utensil? That's the kasha on Rav Sheshes. Amalach Rav Sheshes. So Rav Sheshes will give a different interpretation, and he will say ma nolo davar hamasuyim, just like a nol is a complete thing. What do we mean a complete thing? It's a standalone item, right? A shoe. A shoe is a shoe all day long. It's a complete item. So he's saying that just like a nol is dava hamasuyim, af kol dava hamayusuyim, I allow you to use any complete item. To what extent? La'afuke chatzi rimon v'chatzi ego. So you can use a fruit. I'm saying you can use produce, literally produce. But you can't use a half of an egos. You can't use a half of a rimon. We learned from Noel that it has to be Messiah and it has to be a whole item. You take a rimon, a beautiful round rimon, yes, you can use it. You slice the rimon in half, you can't use a half a rimon. So again, we're talking words here, but words are important because the machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes isn't just hypothetical. I mean, they are tanoim. So they are being very careful in their understanding of what the pasuk means. Chazak ishnalo. So this machlokes back and forth between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes is the machlokes between Rav and Levi. That according to Rav Nachman, it's strict construction nalo, and that's what it means. Any kli is valid, and according to Rav Sheshes, you don't need a kli as long as it's a whole item, not a half an item. A whole item allows you to make the transaction, whether it's a fruit or whether it's a ring or whether it's something else that isn't considered a kli. You're allowed to make a kinyan on all of those things. Now, that being the machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes, we extrapolate to our Gemara that we started with Rav and Levi. Rav will hold like Rav Nachman, and Levi will hold like Rav Sheshes. The point being that according to Rav, it's going to be Boaz, the koner, the acquirer, who is going to be giving the shoe. And according to Levi, he holds like Rav Sheshes that it is the person who is giving the makneh, in this case, the unnamed heir, who is going to be giving the schusim, the rights to acquire Noami's property, and so that's going to be Levi, and that's going to be Rav Sheshes.
Rabbi, I have a question as it relates to Rus. So, if the unidentified relative, doesn't he have to go through the action first? In other words, according to the Megillah, he's got the first right. So he has to make it evident that he will or not accept the obligation to marry her. So he's not passing the right to Boaz before he rejects the right himself. Is that right?
Well, it's a simultaneous action because remember, what's the pasuk? V'zos lifnim b'Yisrael. This unnamed relative and Boaz are now establishing the black letter law at the time of what to do. So it's a simultaneous thing. Right now, before anything happens, the next step is the unnamed relative has to make a transaction. He's shirking that responsibility. He's saying, I don't want to do it. How am I going to get rid of it? I'm going to pass it on to you, Boaz, by doing an action.
So doesn't he have to make the signal, not the one, because he has to signal first?
And that's
exactly rejecting that.
And that's exactly Levi and Rav Shesh's position. You're absolutely right. They say he has to make the action because the action is his. So it has to be he who has to initiate the transaction, i.e., the shoe. So that's why they say it has to be his shoe.
So if Boaz did the action first before he acted, it would be presumptive to make that happen. So the fact that you're next in line, you don't jump ahead. You have to be given the next opportunity to demonstrate by either the first party accepting or rejecting. And I can understand if he, whatever the symbol is and removing his shoe, but it would have to be him removing his shoe because then he's passing it on to the next person.
Right. Again, you're asking a valid question, and that's the source. What you're asking is the reason why both Rabbi Yehuda and Levi say, in order for this transaction to kick off, it has to be the one who has the obligation. He has to make the first move. You're right. Right. So the kasha is on Rab Nachman, right? The kasha is on Rab Nachman. How does Rab Nachman interpret this pasuk to say that it is Boaz who takes the first step, right? According to your question, it should be unanimous that everyone should agree it should be the unnamed relative.
Well, but Boaz is making a declaration, either you, and if not you, me. So he's forcing the action in the sense of forcing him to make a decision at that point in time.
Right.
So his action is dependent on the other relative's action. So he is forcing that action. So otherwise nothing could happen.
That's correct. So let's crystallize. You've asked the source of the machlokes between Rab Nachman and Rab Sheshes, and thereby Rav and Levi, is whether we require the person who has the obligation to take the first step, or the person who wants to take the achrayas to take the first step. That's very much your point. Your point is, shouldn't it be the one who has the responsibility to take the first step? That's very logical. And that would be the unnamed relative, and that would be Levi's view and Rabbi Yehuda's view. So that's a good kasha. Comes Boaz, or comes the other view, which is Rav and Rab Nachman, and says, you know what? You're right. He should take the first step, but it's the person who will eventually take over the achrayas who has to make the kinyan, because he's going to be the central figure going forward. So they're putting the burden on the person who is going to be the recipient of this kinyan to make the kinyan, so that in a sense, you have to understand that if I want to acquire something from you, then I've got to give something up. Me, the acquirer, has to give something up if I want to get it from you, because you don't have to give it to me. So I've got to initiate an action that will allow you to give it to me. That's Rab Nachman's view. Rab Nachman's view is, therefore, Boaz's shoe is the one that has to be used, because Boaz is saying, here, take my shoe and pass on to me the rights to redeem the property of Naomi. So again, it's two sides of every coin, Michael. And
I understand. But what bothers me about all this, if I understand correctly, if Boaz didn't take action, nothing would happen. So the widow's left till somebody initiates it. And so he can force the action. She's the one who is impacted by this. She can't do a thing.
Right.
And so, again, it's like she's being treated like chattel.
She's on the sideline waiting to see who's going to be her redeemer.
But if the first heir had done nothing, he could go through life doing nothing, and she would be stuck where she is.
Well,
how do you force that?
She'd be stuck with the property. Remember, it's her property. The property that she inherited from her husband is her property.
Right. But if she wanted to get married,
yes,
she's prevented from doing so until this occurs.
Well, I don't know that it's correct to say she's prevented from doing so. She can, again, strictly speaking, at the time, the way the system worked is that when a woman loses her husband, all right, in this case, the property should really have gone to the children. but the children died. Machlon and Killian
Right.
are no longer here. So it went back up to Naomi, because remember, but before all of this, it wasn't Naomi who was inheriting, it was Machlon and Killian, but they're
Right.
not here. So Naomi inherits. Now she has this property, she wants to get married. So no one is preventing her from getting married, but in the hierarchy of things, there is a goel, there is a redeemer who should redeem her property.
No, but she's halakhically prohibited from getting married until this is resolved. It may not affect the property. The property could probably be handled differently
That's the
through
point.
Naomi.
So
No,
property's
she had
more important
children.
than the
It's
person.
not a Yibum
But Ruth
situation.
is the one who's bound and stuck.
It's not a Yibum situation.
It's not?
What did you say, David?
Oh, you're right. It's not. Oh, that's true. Because
Not a
Yibum, we say
Yibum-
normally
not a
just
Yibum
the
situation.
You're
not
right.
a-
It's not a strict Yibum situation because it's
Yeah, there's no Yibum. No, there's
not
no
a brother.
Yibum.
You're right. All right. But we learn a lot of Yibum from this. Is how we do Yibum. But you're right. You're right. It's not a strict Yibum because it's not a brother.
No.
Because of the farther relative.
On Michael's question, there's one other intervening fact, which is when Boaz brought up the situation, which Tov or whatever his name is, Ploni Almoni, either didn't know or pretended not to know. When Boaz brought it up, he said, "Yeah, I'll redeem the property," and he only refused when Boaz said that, "But you have to marry Ruth too."
Right. So
he was willing to take the property.
Right. So this is not an Aguna situation. This is not a situation where there's a prohibition of where she can't get married. But there is a hierarchy, and so the Gemara is trying to just explain that hierarchy by saying that there was a redeemer, there was a relative, and he passed. Who's the next relative? Boaz. Now we're breaking down. So what's the technical characteristics of how this happens? That's this machlokes between Tanoim and Amoraim. We know that the way to do it is through the utensil, the noal, which forevermore will be the definition of how one transfers property according to the Gemara. And the question becomes, whose is it and who initiates? So we're stuck with, we're delving into this machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and between Rabbi Nachman and Rabbi Sheshes, but now we're going further and we're saying that the machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda is, now that we know that we have to use this kli, does the kli have to have value? Says the Tanakama, you can use a kli even if the kli is not worth a shava and Rabbi Yehuda comes along and he defines it further that no, it doesn't have to be that you can use a produce, you can use something that is not a kli, and it has to be worth something. So then the kasha became, well, that makes a lot of sense. So then how does Rav Sheshes answer that? So the Gemara says that the machlokes here is whether or not davar mesuyim. In other words, do you have to have a complete item, a whole item, or can you have half an item? So now we've boiled this machlokes down to its most basic element, and we say that on one side you can use only a kli, and on the other side you can use something other than a kli if it's worth a shava pruta, but a kli doesn't have to be worth a shava pruta. So again, this is the way the machlokes boils down to how one transacted with Kinyan Sudar. And again, like David said, we're talking in real time. We're not talking halacha l'maisa, which we can advance probably next time. But here we're talking about, at the time of the Gemara, how this all worked out. Now, so it's a unique question, and we have two sides, each of which has a basis in the pasuk, because the pasuk has that ambiguity as to whether or not it was Boaz or it was the Ploni Almoni, the unnamed source. Again, so now we're left with that. Now, so now we will just finish up here. the next step to this question, what's the formula? In other words, what's the formula that's used in order to make this exchange that the pasuk tells us? So that says the Gemara, Omer Rav Sheshes Berei Ravidi. Rav Sheshes says in the name of Ravidi, Kaman Kasivna Ha'idna. How do we, in other words, going forward, how do we write the shtar? How do we write the agreement for this kind of transaction, right? In order to have a kinyan suda. So he says that the magic words, if you will, is b'mona de kosher lamakna bay, that with an item. It doesn't say necessarily that it's a kli. It says b'mona, with an item, the kosher, that is proper, the mikna bay, to acquire with it. So again, that has a lot of ambiguity built into it, but that's the lashon that we write into the agreement. If we're writing an agreement, it's b'mona de kosher the makna bay. Now let's just break this down. What does b'mona mean, utensil? So he says la'afuki midrav sheshes to amakanim beperis. So we just threw out Rav Sheshes. I mean, we threw out Rav Sheshes and Levi by saying it has to be a kli, right? The word mona means, according to this view, an actual kli, right? La'afuki mid Rav Sheshes to amakanim peris, excluding Rav Sheshes, who says you can use peris. So again, this is like now further black letter law. Rav Sheshes wants to further. It says in the name of Edi that this is how we have to interpret it. The kosher, what does the kosher means that we say it's proper? La'afuke midish Shmuel. So what does that mean? La'afuke midish Shmuel, to exclude Shmuel, the Omar, who says Memzayin Mebeis b'meruka, that you can use meruka. What is meruka? Meruka is they used to use the dried cow dung was used as a kli, and once it dried, it was hard, so they used it as a kli. Says Rashi, kli ha'osi migole bakar. It's a kli that was used from the dung of a cow, of a cow and owl. So in other words, you can't use that, says Rav Sheshes, because it's not choshuv. That's not something that is appropriate. Lamakne. What is the word makne in this lashon? Means to acquire. La'afuke mid Levi. This comes to exclude Levi. The Oma b'kilyo shel makne. This now specifically excludes Levi, whose view was that you can use the kli of the person making the transfer. Again, we're going step by step by step to define exactly what is appropriate for a kinyan sudar. Komash malon lemikne v'lo leknuye. So it comes to teach us lemakne v'lo leknuye. That it's that reading to lemakne v'lo leknuye, that is the way we perform it, which is excluding Levi. And bay, the last word is, bay means kind of with the item. What does that mean? Rav Papa Omar lemute matbeya. That finally, we're coming back to our original question: can you use a coin? Can you use money? So the answer is that it says with it. He defines it that it excludes a matbeya, that you can't use a matbeya, okay? And so the word it refers to the kli, and we're being specific that it's a kli and not something other than a kli, which means matbeya. Rav Zvid v'itema Rav Ashi Omar. Rav Zvid, also with the name of Rav Ashi, says that lamute isure hano, that it doesn't mean necessarily to exclude a coin, but it means to exclude Issa Hano. For instance, if you have an item that is excluded because it's a davar tameh, or it's a davar, it's something that comes from a town that Ashurim, that they served idols or other things. So that's the exclusion. So now again, Rashi lemakne mashma liknos bo v'lo mashma lahaknos alma kelev shel kona kaomar. Again, proof to Rav or Rav Nachman's view that it's the kelev of the kona. Be mashma miat bo v'lo b'dava acher. Strictly with this item and not with anything else. Okay, so what have we come to? So we'll stop here because again, we're going to expand this a little bit, Mitzvah Shem, next time. But we've now defined this Kinyan Sudar step by step from the very top. We said that we started out with a machlokes of Rav and Levi. It's a machlokes Tanoim, and we used. This is a good example of how the Chazal, in this case, I mean, you have the Tanoim, and then later the Amoraim, who took every word and they parsed every word. Now, they didn't agree on the definition of every word, but every word was parsed and every word mattered. So that you took the pasuk from Boaz and you broke it down, even with the ambiguity of who does it. And now the Gemara is saying that the formula that we use is b'mona dekasha l'maknebei. We're going to see halachically whether that's still valid, but let's just say that that's what we're working with, that it has to be b'mona dekasha l'maknebei. Each word has a distinct meaning, and we come out at the end to our proof that we hold like Rav, not like Levi, that it is the acquirer whose item we use, and not the makneh, the person who is delivering from this pasuk. And that's really what we wanted to accomplish when we started the Gemara, is whose item are we using? Answer is, we're using the Kohen's item. Who would that be in this case? That would be Boaz. Boaz is acquiring from the Ploni Almoni, so it is his shoe. Now again, when you do a quick reading, as we all have done many times when we read Megillus Rus, Shalaf Ish Nalo v'Nosan L'Re'ehu, I always, before learning this Gemara, my interpretation was Boaz took it off and gave it. That was my simple definition, because from the words, that's what leaped off to me. I don't know if it does to you, but Shalaf Ish, right? But you're now learning the depth of this, that there's a real possibility it wasn't Boaz's shoe. But when you read it simply, it says, Shalaf Ish Nalo, he took off his shoe, v'Nosan L'Re'ehu, v'Zos to be Israel. It's Boaz who is the principal character in this story, not Ploni Almoni. So it's a good understanding that when you read something, what's on paper is necessarily what is really the deep meaning. Because I know for me, I always thought it was Boaz. I had no havamina it was anyone but Boaz. Once I started learning this Gemara, I realized, wait a minute, maybe it's not Boaz. Maybe it's the Ploni Almoni. But we come out, the way we understand it, that it is Boaz. Because we're saying that the Kaim Yisrael, that it means Shalaf Ish Nalo means Boaz, the recipient, not Ploni Almoni, who is the giver, the one who's extending. So again, it's fascinating to see how the Gemara plumbs the depth of what seems to be a very simple pasuk in the Ksuvim, in the Rus, but yet we see that the depth of this is really quite detailed. So anyway, so we've come to sort of a conclusion on this. But let's keep an open mind, because we've still got a little bit to go. We'll have to do a quick chazara. We'll forget a little bit in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But this is where we leave off today. And with that, I will say Gemar Chasima Tova. If you're davening, but if your mind slips a little bit, you'll remember this Gemara. You'll understand that all of Chazal has a great value to all of us, and we should all be zeicha to have a continued success in our lives and in our learning. The Rebbeinu Shalom should give us a Gemar Chasima Tova.
Amen. Thank you.